Boccaccio's first story out of the gate is very indicative of what will follow. It is funny, it is quite touching in its own way, and it holds up for a certain ridicule, a kind of attitude about religion and piety that he seems to see, the text at least, seems to see as counterintuitive, as being somehow opposed to the true spirit of religion and of God himself. And he starts it off, and you get this sense of this kind of bipolarity of the thing, where the speaker is begins with this long introduction of the story and saying, well, to start, I intend to start off with one of his, God's marvelous works. All of this is fitting that everything man does should take its origin as the wonderful and holy name of him who was the maker of all things. And it's this very prolix, formal, gratuitous credit to God, this whole opening paragraph. And it's very nice, and it's very pious. And then the story that starts with the second paragraph is almost a send-up of that, because it concerns this young merchant, or not young, he's an old merchant or clerk or something. Essentially, you get the sense that he's kind of a lawyer, and he is told to go and clean up some affairs for this wealthy merchant, and he goes and does so. And while he's out of town, he is taken ill, and he has been told, the reader has been told that, well, this isn't, he is very old, but he's also, the portrait that's given of him is of a great sinner, quite frankly. He's somebody who is, who drinks and fornicates and has apparently killed people just for the fun of it. You get the sense that he has indulged in every possible sin it is possible to indulge in, and he seems to have enjoyed it and shown zero remorse about any of it. And now he is in an advanced age, after a somewhat dissolute life. He is dying. He's on his way out, and the two brothers with whom he is staying, essentially renting a room with, they get together and they have a talk, like, what are we gonna do with this guy? This guy is dying, and he seems to be a little shady. Are we going to be stuck with a corpse? Are we not going to be able to unload it? What are we supposed to do? And Sir Chiaparello hears this and calls them in and says, okay, look, I know what you were saying. I feel bad about it. Now, they were essentially just debating among themselves whether or not they should take care of someone who is dying. So, who's the real sinner here is immediately the contrast. His response to that is not outrage, but that, let me put your mind at ease. So immediately, first, the dynamic is one of the great sinner has compassion. The great sinner is somebody who is thinking about others. And the two proper middle-class bourgeois, rising bourgeois tradesmen, or whatever they are, were in sort of a moral iffy spot on saying, well, what are we going to do with this guy? Can we really throw him out? Is there any reason? Do we have any justification to do so? Do we have any excuse? What happens? it's it's disturbing just that that dynamic is so quickly brought out. Their last line in the Wayne Rebhorn translation is, "So no matter how things work out, it'll be bad for us if this guy dies," which is a cold line to leave on. So then that's the impression that the text leaves, and then to counter that immediately with, "I don't want you to fear anything on my account," he told them, "or to be afraid you'll be harmed because of me," which on the surface is rather noble. It is very much a Christian instinct. So he says, "Okay, go get a priest, go to a friar or somebody from the local monastery, have them come over, and I will confess my sins, and thus clear up any concern about that. I will be absolved in the view of the church, and everything will be okay for you then." And they do that. They manage to go and find they find a priest to come and listen to him, or a friar. I forget exactly. It was a friar, a monk, and he is going to listen to the confession. Now, in the back of everybody's mind who's reading this, they're saying, what is this guy really going to say? Is he going to be telling the truth? Because this could get pretty ugly. And this, of course, builds up the suspense a little bit. It's not a long period before he starts talking and unrolling this stuff, but that little moment when he says, I'll do a confession. Are you sure you want to do that? That's going to be the reaction of the reader, and that's going to sort of bring everybody in, because okay, I want to hear the details. I've just heard like the Cliff Notes version of the sinning. I'd really like to hear the story behind it. So the priest comes in and asks him, a fairly standard question at the beginning of a confession. How long has it been since your last confession? And this guy, whom we have been told has never had any remorse, never gone to church, never done anything, remotely devout in his life, apparently, he comes out and he says, "I used to go to church, or I used to go to confession once a week, but since it used to be my custom to go to confession at least once a week, without counting the many weeks in which I went more often. Since I've been sick for a week now, the truth is that the suffering I've endured from my illness has been so great that it's prevented me from going to confession." Okay, so he says, "I used to go all the time, many times a week." Really? Okay. His first part of the confession is a flat out lie. Bald-faced, earnest in his delivery, and kind of laughable. He's overdoing it a little bit. But the friar, he laps it up. "Oh, well, you don't have to go that often. No, I don't want to take any risks with my soul." And so he says, So even as I sit down now, I don't want to just tell you what I've sinned since my last confession. I want to go back to the start. I want to do it all." And of course, now the reader is leaning forward saying, "Yeah, okay, now I'm going to get the juicy stuff. I don't believe what he's doing, but I want to watch him go down, because this is going to be good." And so they start going through them. And he asks, the priest asked the first one, "Okay, what does the institutional church really care about?" "Well, have you ever, you're unmarried, have you ever fornicated outside of marriage or whatever? If you've never been married." And his immediate response is, "Never. I am a virgin today, the same virgin as I was when I came out of my mom's womb." which we have been told already is laughable. And he's going for it. He is swinging for the fences. He doesn't care. And that's sort of funny. And you're going like, oh, okay. So you get past that and you find like, so they start clicking through the other sins. They get to gluttony, and he talks about how, I have, although it was his habit to fast on bread and water at least 3 days a week, in addition to doing so the periods of fasting that devout people observed on holy days throughout the year, he had nevertheless drunk that water with as much delight and gusto as any wine drinker ever drank his wine. The guy's a drunk. The guy's a lush. He admits this. But right here he's saying, no, but man, do I really lust after a clear, cold glass of water. and they click through the others. Avarice. They're going through all of the big sins, and he's always got something about what a terrible sinner he is, and then the example he comes up with is pathetic. It's silly. Have you ever borne false witness against anyone, or spoken ill of others, or taken things from them without their permission? Yes, sir, replied Sir Chiappaletto. I really have spoken ill of others, because once I had a neighbor who, without the least justification, was forever beating his wife. And so one time I criticized him to his wife's family because of the great pity I felt for the wretched creature. Whenever he'd had too much to drink, God alone could tell you how much he used to smack her around. So, reporting or speaking ill of someone is here set up as in contrast to, reporting on something. Which, of course, it's the priest is saying along the way, well, this is not a really serious thing, and, it's okay. But at the same time, you're getting this little portrait of this guy who is sticking up for kind of the right things. The right thing here is to report on the man beating his wife. And somehow that is in conflict in his calculation, in conflict with the strict observance of piety, with the church and the practice of religion as it is organized at the time. So you get this sudden sense of, well, now, is there a difference between morality and doctrine at this point? Is there a difference between how an ethical person would act and how a good Christian would act? Suddenly it's shifting into somewhat complicated places. It's all very funny. He's an adorable little rogue, a classic character, Wine, Women, and Song. Literature is loaded with these characters who are a lot of fun and gather you along so that you are on his side. You're wishing for him, and you're kind of, you're rooting for him to get through all this, and as a consequence, you are opposing yourself to this kind of oafish friar who's sitting there just taking all this down and saying, well, no, that's okay. But you're waiting, you're hoping that he gets one over him after a time, because it is kind of ridiculous. You, the reader, are in the process of aligning with this guy, since he's so charming and the situation is so funny. You are being shifted around to oppose the church. Keeps going. When the friar saw that there was nothing left to say to Sir Chiappaletto, he absolved him and gave him his blessing. You're forgiven for whatever. Taking him to be a very holy man, for he fully believed that what Sir Chiappaletto had said was true, and who would not have believed it? seeing a man at the point of death speak like that. Who would not have believed it? The reader, maybe. Because your understanding is that, well, at the point of death, he would be much more observant of the religious rules, and the religious expectations, the cultural imperatives at play there. But instead, he just does what works for him at the time. His goal in this, it seems, is to get those two gentlemen off the hook, to absolve them of any problem. He doesn't seem at all concerned about his own soul, his own eternal damnation that seems to be dangling in front of him. He is not at all concerned about any of that. It never comes up. There's no real question of the afterlife in this. He's like, no, that's it. I'm on my way out, so let me just clean up here. And there's something really quite noble about that, something really quite Christian about that, in that sense of self-sacrifice. Maybe he is concerned about the state of his soul. Lying to a priest is not going to help that, but he doesn't really show it. We're not given a whole lot of concern about that. But his concern is always about bringing people together, about giving them some solace, calming down his landlords, but also just the community at large in his next request when he says, Sir the friar asked him, Sir Chapelletto, with the help of God, you'll soon be well, but if it should happen that God calls that blessed, well-disposed soul of yours to him, would you like to have your body buried at our monastery? Yes, sir, replied Sir Chapelletto. In fact, I wouldn't want it to be anywhere else, since you've promised to pray to God for me, not to mention the fact that I've always been especially devoted to your order. I will note that because you have promised to pray to God for me, he's basing this on a human connection that he has made with this friar at this point. However, fraudulent the undercurrent of it is, but he's basing it on a human connection, not through a devotion to religion or anything abstract, but there's something right in front of him. Therefore, when you return to your monastery, I beg you to have them send me that most true body of Christ that you consecrate on the altar every morning, for although I'm unworthy of it, I would like, with your permission, to partake of it, and afterward to receive holy extreme unction, so that if I have lived a sinner, at least I may die a Christian. Which gives you a sense that, well, okay, in the outward forms, yeah, maybe he wants to be forgiven. Maybe he doesn't necessarily want to burn in hell if he believes in that. We're not really sure about that. But what comes right before he gets to holy unction is more interesting. When he says, when you return to your monastery, I beg you to have them send me that most true body of Christ that you consecrate on the altar every morning. And what he's talking about there is communion. What he's talking about there is the sharing of the body of Christ, the little wafer, that is a sign of communion, of union with humanity, God's union with humanity, his place in the world. And that's his concern here. Sir Chapelletto, long name, Sir Chapelletto is concerned with the role of humanity, with his participation in humanity. He wants to participate or partake of communion. He wants to be a part of it. He doesn't want to be separate. It's about coming together, bringing together the human elements. And that's what happens after he dies. We're not given a post-biography of his soul, but we see that other people hear his story and start to come together around it. And they come to venerate him as a saint. and he becomes an organizing principle for people coming together. It's a joke, but it's a joke that has an effect. It's a joke that brings people into solidarity with one another, brings people who are perhaps, separate in their own ways, isolated in their own ways, like the people in Florence at the time of the plague. It brings them together. It might be silly, it might be insincere, but it works. It brings them together. It is a true Christian principle in opposition to, or at least in distinction from, the church itself. The organized church as an institution is personified here by the friar, and it seems a little oblivious, a little obtuse, and a little too credulous, quite frankly. But the act of self-sacrifice, the act of trying to give some relief in the world, trying to relieve the suffering of people in this world, that's what Sir Chapelato does in his own way. You can argue about motivations and the ethics behind it, but in a utilitarian way, he accomplishes what the church doesn't seem to be able to do in a forthright and effective manner. He brings people together for comfort. And that's the first story out of the gate with this book. And it's longer than a number of the other stories, certainly than a number of them that follow it soon thereafter. So you get a sense of, okay, this is a very purposeful and intentional placing of this story. It's not randomly scattered. This story sets the tone. This story lines up a lot of the themes. A lot of the themes that are going to follow in the next several stories have to do with hypocrisies of one or the other, and immorality in different religious traditions in one way or the other. And a lot of them are very fun, because it's always making fun. It's always ordinary people who are set up against like these institutions and these like the church, and that difference between something fairly abstract and structural and just normal human connections. And this is what Boccaccio is emphasizing throughout. This is Decameron at its best.